are live on the floor of the 2014 Global Technology Leaders Summit in Menlo Park, and I'm here with Mark Radcliffe, a partner in DLA Piper's corporate and intellectual property practices. And Mark, you just finished moderating a panel titled Collaboration for Innovation. Now, the session examined the success of collaborative open source projects such as the Linux Foundation, which contributes to the development of the Linux operating system. So I'm going to start off by asking you, what makes such large-scale collaborative projects work? How does it work?
Well, it's largely a matter of culture, and I think a matter of need. So the Linux Foundation, the estimate of the value of the Linux operating system is $10 billion.
Okay.
And that's a project that's been going on for over 20 years. But just recently, one of our other panelists talked about Cloud Foundry, and the reason they chose to take Cloud Foundry's proprietary product at Pivotal and put it into an open source foundation. And the reason was that IBM wanted to have that functionality. They figured they'd need to spend $1 billion on it. And the only way they could do that was through an open source foundation. They would not obviously contribute to a project which was proprietary and owned by another company. But that $1 billion investment of IBM would be only part of the cost of creating this functionality. And if IBM itself alone cannot create a product, you know that how critical collaboration has become in this new world of very complex technologies.
So how is it that collaboration can work on such a large scale, but sometimes it breaks down and can be a challenge within a single corporation?
Well, the answer is the structure, governance, and culture of the project are very important. Because there are a number of projects which weren't set up right. Classic example is Symbian, which started as a proprietary project, was put into a foundation. Then what we say is they made it open source. What they really did is they sprinkled open source pixie dust on it.
Okay.
And it didn't take, and Symbian, as people know, is now a dead operating system. Went from a 60% market share to less than 10%, competing with Android, a truly open mobile operating system. So once again, governance is very important. You need to have companies that are willing to be collaborative, that are willing to let the project developers take it in the direction that makes most sense from a technological point of view. And so it can't be smothered. And I think the good news is that through the Linux Foundation, the Apache Software Foundation, we have examples of long-standing projects that have been very successful. But it's still work in progress. Each community has its own culture, and you need to be very clear about what the culture is and how do you make sure you grow that culture.
Okay. So what are some of the challenges and opportunities that are on the horizon right now for the open source community?
Well, I think the open source community is enjoying a great upswing, and deservedly so. Linux is one of the most commonly used operating systems. You also see the Apache web server very widely used across the net. OpenSSL is one of the most significant security programs on the internet. But in some ways, that success has come at a cost. Particularly for the smaller project like OpenSSL, they have not always had the resources that they should have been given in the past. And so I think what we're seeing is as open source moves into the mainstream, and then clearly, if you look at the Gartner reports, basically all of the Fortune 2000 are going to be using open source as a critical resource in their IT infrastructure. Okay. You're going to see the need for people to properly fund some of these projects, and the good news is the Linux Foundation, through Jim Zemlin, who's the executive director, has reached out to some of these projects that in the past have not gotten the resources they need. But more importantly, I think the open source community needs to think through what are the best practices for starting a project, for spinning a proprietary project out into the open source community, for building that community. We're still at the very beginning of getting the answer to many of those questions. So I think the open source community is going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to be very important. And I think we'll also see over time the open source community will become more mature in the sense there'll be standard ways of doing things. Right now, there's a wide variety of answers.
Yes. So how do you think the open source collaboration model can work in other growing areas of technology development, such as the Internet of Things, big data, clean tech, or even public-private space exploration in other industries that we heard about earlier this morning?
Well, I think that the open source model works very well where there's anything that has a fundamental base of technology upon which you can build differentiation. So, and frankly, it's going to be particularly important in the Internet of Things. We talked about that at the beginning, and I think the concern that is expressed by members of the audience and echoed by Jim Zemlin, who is managing the All Seen Alliance, which is an Internet of Things open source project, is the Internet of Things, by its very nature, needs to have a basic agreement on APIs and other standardized processes. If it doesn't, it's going to become balkanized, and it's going to be very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle. And so that's one of the things I think is very important, is the vision of people in the open source community like Jim Zemlin, and seeing that need and moving to fulfill it. And now I think the All Seen Alliance has about 30 corporate members. So I think the methodology that's been used to such success in Linux is now transferring itself to Internet of Things. And even in the hardware area, with the Open Compute Initiative from Facebook, is taking sort of white label servers and once again making them a commodity product and basically shrinking costs. So I think we're at the cusp of a very interesting time as this methodology gets applied to other industries. I mean, now, for example, you have the Geneva Alliance in the automotive industry, you've got Open Mama in the finance industry, so you're seeing open source methodologies being spread across industry.
Okay. Now, I understand you're also quite active in working with companies on their corporate venture capital and innovation programs. So my question for you is, what do business executives need to know about corporate VC, and how does it contribute to the innovation cycle at large companies today?
So corporate venture capital is an area where I've been practicing for over 12 years. I've seen a couple of the cycles. Right now, I think we're seeing a fundamental shift in the nature of corporate venture capital and the need for it. There are now over 1,100 companies that have corporate venture units. And I think that's because of the increasing pace of innovation. And as Greg Becker said in his keynote at lunch, we are in a time of such disruptive innovation where even NASA is, NASA's functions are being privatized, that you need to have a window into that innovation. And a corporate venture fund is a good way to get a window there. There are other techniques such as M&A, alliances, business plan competitions like one run by IBM and SmartCamp, accelerators like the group of accelerators that Microsoft is sponsoring around the world. But businesses that do not engage in this are going to be left behind and frankly be run over. I'll go back to the example of Symbian, where a very successful, very innovative company, Nokia, just was not paying enough attention to what was going on in Silicon Valley and got run over not by a competitor, but by a search company and a computer company. Companies that probably wouldn't have even been on the strategic map of the strategy officers at Nokia in 2005. So the answer is you just don't know who's going to be your competitor in this new environment.
Okay, very interesting. Again, that was Mark Radcliffe of DLA Piper. Mark,
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.